The exact moment Raven realized her fairy tale engagement was a beautifully packaged lie. She was sipping a very dry martini. It was supposed to be a flawless evening. They were seated in the private dining room of an exclusive East Coast restaurant, surrounded by candlelight, crystal, and a tight circle of friends raising their glasses to the happy couple. Grant looked devastatingly handsome in his tailored suit, his hand resting possessively on Raven's waist. He was the charismatic tech founder. She was the elegant daughter of a generational wealth family to the rest of the room. They were the absolute picture of a modern power couple. And then there was Fiona. Fiona, who sat entirely too close to Grant. Fiona, who made a point of wearing distressed leather boots to a black tie optional dinner just to prove how refreshingly unconventional she was. She was Grant's best bro. A woman who loudly proclaimed she only hung out with men because women were too much drama. For months, Raven had politely tolerated Fiona's blatant disregard for boundaries, the late-night texts, the shared drinks, the inside jokes that excluded Raven. Grant had always brushed it off with a charming laugh, insisting Raven was the only woman he loved, and that Fiona was practically one of the guys. But as the final toast ended, and the table erupted in polite applause, Fiona leaned into Grant. Her hand brushed his thigh under the guise of steadying herself, and her lips hovered just an inch from his ear. Amidst the chatter, she whispered a sentence in flawless, hushed Spanish. "Wash up and wait for me tonight." Fiona pulled back, offering Grant a conspiratorial, heavy-lidded smirk. Grant's eyes darkened, a subtle flush creeping up his neck, before he quickly composed himself and kissed Raven's temple for the audience. They thought they were so clever. They assumed Raven, with her perfectly styled hair and philanthropic gala committees, was just a pretty, monolingual ornament. They had forgotten, or simply never cared to learn, that Raven had spent 4 years studying literature in Spain. She spoke Spanish better than she played the piano. The betrayal hit Raven like a physical blow to the chest. The breath was knocked entirely out of her lungs. She loved Grant. She had spent the last 2 years weaving her life into his, defending his ambitious startup to her conservative father, and imagining a future filled with golden retrievers and a sprawling yard in the Hamptons. The pain of realizing the man holding her hand was silently planning to sleep with the woman across the table was a sharp, hot agony. A lesser woman might have thrown the martini in his face. A more foolish woman might have cried right there, begging him to explain it away. But Raven possessed a spine forged from steel and a terrifying sense of self-respect. She slowly lowered her glass, her manicured fingers perfectly steady. She looked at Grant, really looked at him, and watched the illusion of the man she loved evaporate into thin air. The car ride back to her luxury penthouse was suffocatingly quiet. The rain lashed against the tinted windows, reflecting the neon city lights across Grant. Relaxed, oblivious face, as the elevator doors slid open to their foyer, Raven didn't scream or throw her purse. She slipped off her heels and turned to him. "Wash up and wait for me tonight," Raven said, her voice eerily calm, translating the phrase into perfectly clipped English. "Is that the standard sign-off for your frat brothers, Grant? Or just the ones who wear lip gloss?" Grant froze. The easy, confident smile slid off his face, replaced by a fleeting second of genuine panic. But men like Grant, narcissists who thrived on the adoration of multiple women, never apologized. They pivoted. "Are you seriously doing this tonight?" Grant sighed, running a hand through his hair, instantly deploying the weapon he always used to keep her in line, gaslighting. "Fiona and I were joking around. It's an inside joke from a movie." Raven: "God, why do you always have to be so paranoid?" "An inside joke," Raven repeated. The sheer audacity of his lie turning her heartbreak into a block of solid ice. Yes, she's my best friend. We grew up together. I don't even see her as a woman. Okay, we don't see gender in our friendship. You reacting crazy right now, and frankly, it's insulting that you would accuse me of this on the night we re-celebrating our engagement. He played the wounded victim to perfection, shaking his head in manufactured disgust before storming down the hall and slamming the door to the guest bedroom. It was his signature move, punishing her with silence until she felt crazy enough to apologize. Raven stood alone in the magnificent, echoing foyer. A single tear betrayed her, sliding hot down her cheek, grieving the death of the relationship she thought she had. But that was the only tear she allowed him. If he wanted to insult her intelligence, if he truly believed he could manipulate her into accepting his infidelity under the guise of an enlightened, genderless friendship, he had severely underestimated the woman he was dealing with. She wasn't going to spend the night agonizing over a man who had already made his choice. If gender truly didn't matter in the sacred bond of friendship, as Grant so passionately claimed, then Raven figured it was time to test that theory. She pulled her phone from her clutch, the bright screen illuminating her sharp, predatory smile. She scrolled past the dozens of congratulatory messages and tapped on the contact for Ben, her fabulous, unapologetically wealthy, and very proudly gay best friend. Emergency, she texted. I need a sleepover. Bring your gorgeous boyfriend and make sure you both pack the silk pajamas. Ben and his partner, Julian, arrived at the penthouse in under 30 minutes, armed with a bottle of vintage Dom Pifrignon and an arsenal of expensive skincare. Ben, a high-powered art dealer with a tongue sharper than a surgical scalpel, took one look at Raven's terrifyingly calm posture and understood the assignment immediately. There were no tears, no boxes of tissues, and absolutely no wallowing. Tonight was strictly about mirroring. Within the hour, the three of them were lounging in the center of Raven's massive California king bed, draped in matching emerald green silk pajamas. They had applied gold leaf eye masks and were sipping champagne while a classic Audrey Hepburn film played on the muted television. The atmosphere was delightfully indulgent, a warm cocoon of genuine friendship that stood in stark contrast to the cold betrayal sleeping down the hall. Raven picked up her phone, framing the shot perfectly. She made sure to capture the plush pillows, the champagne flutes, and the unmistakable presence of two handsome men bracketing her on either side. With a detached, clinical precision, she typed out a caption. Just the guys having a late-night sleepover. So thankful for my bros. Number brotherhood, number no boundaries. She tagged Grant, hit post on her social media, and set her phone on the nightstand. It took exactly 4 minutes. The heavy oak door of the master bedroom flew open with such violent force it bounced off the wall stop. Grant stood in the doorway, his face mottled with dark, furious red, his phone clenched so tightly in his hand his knuckles were white. The charming, sophisticated tech founder was gone, replaced by a possessive, territorial man whose fragile ego had just been publicly detonated. What the hell is going on here? Grant bellowed, his eyes darting frantically between Raven and the two men comfortably situated in her bed. Raven didn't flinch. She took a slow, elegant sip of her champagne and leaned back against the tufted headboard. Keep your voice down, Grant. You re-ruining the movie. Are you insane? He stepped into the room, pointing a trembling finger at the bed. There are 2 grown men in your bed, Raven in your pajamas. What is wrong with you? Have you lost your mind? Stop scrolling and look at this masterpiece of behavioral mirroring. Most women, when gaslighted, try to argue with the gaslighter. They bring logic to a knife fight. Raven, she didn't argue. She simply brought the exact same logic into the bedroom, wearing silk pajamas. Grant's reaction proves the oldest rule in the book. A man who claims gender doesn't matter in friendship only believes it when he is the one crossing the boundaries. The moment Raven adopted his cool girl philosophy with two men, his progressive facade crumbled into insecure, possessive dust. Raven didn't scream. She conducted a live sociology experiment. She proved that his friendship with Fiona wasn't modern. It was just convenient hypocrisy. Ladies, if he calls you crazy for being suspicious, invite Ben and Julian over. Watch how quickly he finds his sanity. Raven looked at Ben, who was casually examining his manicure, and then back at Grant. The corner of her mouth curled into a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. "They were just my best friends, Grant," Raven said, her voice a perfect, melodic echo of the exact tone he had used on her just an hour ago. "We grew up together. I don't even see them as men. Really, we don't see gender in our friendship. Why do you always have to be so paranoid?" Grant stopped dead in his tracks. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of his own argument, weaponized and fed right back to him, caused a visible short circuit in his brain. He stammered, searching for a loophole in a logic he had invented to protect his own infidelity. That is entirely different," Grant sputtered, his voice cracking with desperation. "I am a man, Fiona is a woman, but she is a tomboy. Ben and Julian are. They are men, and they are in your bed." "Honestly, Grant," Ben interjected, peeling off his eye mask with a theatrical sigh. "You reacting crazy right now. It's insulting that you would accuse Raven of anything untoward. It's just an inside joke. God, your jealousy is so toxic." The satisfaction of watching the self-righteous narcissist choke on his own medicine was better than the champagne. Raven felt a profound, empowering shift deep within her chest. The spell was broken. She looked at this man sweating, shouting, utterly incapable of holding himself to the same standards he demanded of her, and realized she was looking at a stranger, a very small, very pathetic stranger, before Grant could launch into another hypocritical tirade. His phone began to vibrate violently in his hand. He glanced at the screen, and the anger on his face instantly morphed into frantic concern. It was Fiona. He swiped to answer, turning his back to Raven. "Fi, what is wrong?" he demanded, his voice dropping an octave into a tone of protective intimacy that made Raven's stomach turn. Through the quiet room, Raven could hear Fiona's manufactured, hysterical sobbing coming through the receiver. She was claiming she was at her Aspen ski trip, alone in her cabin, suffering from a severe panic attack. She couldn't breathe. She needed him. She needed her best friend. Grant hung up the phone and spun around, already calculating his exit. "Fiona is having a medical emergency. I have to go to Aspen now." Raven felt a sudden sharp ache in her temples, a genuine physical manifestation of the evening's exhaustion and the freezing rain from earlier. "I am running a fever, Grant," she stated quietly, stating a fact rather than making a plea. Grant didn't even pause on his way to the walk-in closet to grab his leather duffel bag. "You have Ben and Julian here." He threw over his shoulder, carelessly zipping up his bag. "Fiona is all alone. If you can understand that my friend needs me right now, then you even more selfish than I thought." He didn't look back. He didn't check her forehead. He just walked out, the front door slamming shut with a heavy, definitive thud that echoed through the penthouse. Raven sat in the silence, the fever bringing a flush to her cheeks. But her mind had never been colder or clearer. The last stubborn ember of her love for Grant extinguished, leaving behind nothing but the stark, illuminating light of self-preservation. He had made his choice. Now she would make hers. She picked up her phone, ready to dial her family's trust attorney and begin the clinical process of severing the massive financial lifeline her family provided to his company. But before her thumb could press the screen, an incoming message popped up. It was from a number she hadn't texted in 2 years, belonging to a man who operated entirely in the shadows of the city's financial elite Pierce. The message was painfully brief, yet it contained the weight of an entire empire. "I have a jet waiting at Teterboro, and the room number for Fiona's suite in Aspen. Say the word." Raven stared at the glowing screen of her phone. Pierce. The name alone carried a weight in their circles that demanded respect, if not outright fear. He was a man of quiet, devastating power, a titan of venture capital who preferred the shadows to the spotlight. They had crossed paths years ago at a charity gala in Geneva, back when she was still a student, and he was already securing his empire. There had been a spark, a lingering gaze over a roulette table, a conversation about Proust that lasted until dawn, but timing and circumstance had kept them apart. When she returned to the States and became entangled in Grant's orbit, Pierce had stepped back, a silent observer across crowded rooms. But he had never really looked away, say the word. Raven didn't hesitate. She didn't let the fever slow her down, or let the ghost of her shattered relationship guilt her into inaction. She tapped out a single word. Yes. Within 30 minutes, a discreet black SUV idled downstairs. Ben and Julian, who had insisted on packing her a small, impeccably curated overnight bag, hugged her fiercely at the door. "Ruin him, darling," Ben whispered, pressing a sleek black compact into her hand. "But make sure you look flawless doing it." The flight on Pierce's private Gulfstream was a masterclass in silent efficiency. Pierce wasn't there. He was currently dismantling a rival firm in London, she knew, but his presence was woven into every detail. A cashmere blanket was waiting on her seat, alongside a dossier marked confidential and a small matte black keycard. There was no overly emotional note, no attempt to capitalize on her vulnerability. Just the tools she needed to execute her revenge, provided by a man who understood that a woman like Raven didn't need saving, she needed ammunition. She spent the flight reviewing the dossier. It was a comprehensive, terrifyingly detailed investigation into Fiona's life. What Raven read made her blood run cold and then boil Grant. In his staggering arrogance, truly believed he and Fiona were engaging in some rebellious, bohemian romance that defied societal norms. He thought he was the center of her universe. The truth was infinitely more humiliating. Fiona was married. Not just married, but legally bound to a prominent, closeted European aristocrat. In a highly lucrative, ironclad lavender marriage. Her tomboy persona, her disdain for women, her sudden trips abroad, it was all a carefully constructed facade to maintain her husband's public image while she lived off a massive allowance. And Grant was nothing more than her American plaything, a convenient free escort she could summon whenever the mood struck, using his blind narcissism to keep him hooked while she played the devoted wife overseas. Raven closed the dossier as the jet descended through the snow-capped peaks of Aspen. She didn't feel rage anymore. She felt an overwhelming sense of pity for the fool she had almost married. The luxury resort was a fortress of timber and glass nestled against the mountainside. The concierge, clearly briefed by Pierce's people, handed her an additional master key without making eye contact. Raven bypassed the grand lobby, her designer boots silent on the plush carpet of the executive floor. She stood outside Suite 402. The air was thin and crisp, smelling faintly of pine and expensive wood smoke. From the other side of the heavy oak door, she could hear the muffled, unmistakable sounds of Grant's voice, low and urgent, followed by Fiona's breathless laughter. There was no panic attack. There was no medical emergency. There was only the ugly, predictable rhythm of a cheap affair. A lesser woman might have pounded on the door, screaming demands for an explanation. A woman still tethered by love might have turned away, unable to bear the sight. But Raven was operating on a different frequency now. She was a surgeon about to excise a tumor. She took a deep breath, smoothing the lapels of her pristine white cashmere coat. She reached into her bag, pulling out the sleek, heavy box she had purchased at the private terminal's luxury boutique before boarding. It wasn't champagne or caviar. It was the most expensive, absurdly branded box of premium condoms she could find, $50 for a pack of 3. With her other hand, she slid Pierce's black keycard into the electronic lock. The little light flashed a vibrant, welcoming green. The locking mechanism clicked back with a heavy, satisfying thud. Raven pushed the door open and stepped into the illusion. The suite was a sprawling masterpiece of alpine luxury, complete with a roaring fireplace and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the snow-dusted peaks. But Raven barely registered the decor. Her gaze locked immediately onto the massive king-size bed in the center of the room. It was exactly as she had anticipated. Yet the visual confirmation still carried a clinical shock. The heavy duvet was shoved to the floor, replaced by a tangle of limbs and discarded clothing. Grant's designer watch glinted in the firelight on the nightstand next to Fiona's signature leather boots. The heavy thud of the door closing behind Raven echoed like a gunshot. Grant and Fiona froze, their frantic movements halting mid-air. For a singular, suspended second, the room was so quiet Raven could hear the crackle of the burning pine logs. Then, the panic set in. "Raven?" Grant gasped, his voice cracking violently as he scrambled backward, desperately clawing for the discarded duvet to cover himself. He looked like a man who had just been electrocuted, his face drained of color, his jaw working uselessly as he tried to construct a lie that could possibly explain away the undeniable reality of his nakedness in another woman's bed. Fiona, for all her cool girl bravado, shrieked and dove under the pillows, clutching the sheet to her chest. The fearless tomboy who confidently whispered sexual invitations in Spanish was suddenly nothing more than a terrified cliché. Raven stood at the foot of the bed, a vision in white cashmere, looking down at them with an expression of profound, chilling boredom. She didn't scream. She didn't throw a lamp. She simply reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and with the detached efficiency of a crime scene photographer, snapped 3 rapid, perfectly lit photos. The artificial shutter sounds punctuated the heavy silence, each click driving another nail into the coffin of Grant's carefully curated life. "What are you doing?" Grant shouted, panic escalating into raw terror as he realized the leverage she now held. "Raven, stop! Put the phone away! I can explain. It's not what it looks like. It's not what it looks like," Raven repeated, her voice smooth and devoid of any tremble. She looked from his pale, sweating face to the crumpled mess of Fiona under the sheets. "So Fiona isn't having a medical emergency, because from where I am standing, it looks like you are applying some very aggressive, full-body CPR." Grant choked on his own spit, his narcissism failing him completely in the face of her icy sarcasm. "Raven, please. You don't understand. She needed me. I was just trying to comfort her." "I see," Raven said, nodding slowly. "And comfort requires both of you to be completely naked in a $5,000 a night suite. That's incredibly dedicated friendship. Grant, I must apologize for my lack of understanding regarding the nuances of your brotherhood. Fiona peeked out from under the pillow, her eye makeup smeared, attempting to salvage some scrap of dignity. Raven, you are invading my privacy. You have no right to be here, and you have no right to the man wearing my engagement ring. Yet here we are, Fiona, Raven countered, her tone slicing through the room like a freshly honed blade. Though frankly, you can keep him. He is clearly a high-maintenance charity case. She took a deliberate step closer to the bed, causing Grant to physically recoil. She reached into her pristine designer bag and pulled out the sleek, heavy black box she had purchased at the airport. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed it onto the tangled sheets, right between Grant's scrambling legs. The box landed with a soft thud, premium ultra-thin. Grant stared at the box, his expression a mix of utter confusion and profound humiliation. What is this? This is what I call aggressive benevolence. Bringing condoms to your fiancé's affair isn't an act of submission. It is the ultimate insult. It says, I am not threatened by this. I am merely concerned about hygiene. By tossing that box on the bed, Raven stripped the affair of its forbidden romance's narrative. She reduced Grant and Fiona from star-crossed lovers to two sweaty people making a mess who needed to be managed like toddlers. It's clinical, it's demeaning, it's perfect. She didn't cry over his betrayal. She treated it like a sanitation issue. When you look at a cheater with disgust rather than heartbreak, you have already won. Consider it a care package, Raven said, a razor-thin smile gracing her lips. I remembered how passionate you were last night about how gender doesn't matter in your friendship, but just in case biology decides to disagree with your philosophy, I brought supplies after all. Bros can't get pregnant, right, Grant? The silence that followed was total and absolute. Grant stared at the box as if it were a live grenade. The insult was so surgical, so perfectly calibrated, that it bypassed his anger and struck directly at his ego, shattering it completely. He was not a misunderstood romantic hero. He was the punchline to a brutal joke. Raven turned on her heel. The soft swish of her cashmere, the only sound in the room. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. As she walked back out into the crisp mountain air, she didn't feel the fever anymore. She felt an exhilarating, intoxicating lightness. She pulled out her phone, dialing the number for her family's lead. The phone rang only once before it was answered. Richard, Raven said, her voice clear and commanding. It's Raven. Execute the withdrawal clause on Grant's startup. Every single dollar. By the time he lands back in New York, I want his company running on fumes. She hung up, sliding into the waiting black SUV. As the car pulled away from the resort, she glanced down at her phone. A message from Pierce was waiting. Did the delivery arrive safely? Raven smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes for the first time in weeks. Perfectly, she typed back. Now, tell me more about Fiona's husband. The financial slaughter was swift, silent, and flawlessly executed. While Grant was presumably scrambling for a return flight, frantically trying to construct a narrative that would save his skin, Raven was systematically dismantling his empire. By Tuesday morning, Grant's sleek, glass-walled tech startup in Manhattan was a ghost town of panicked executives. The massive capital injection from Raven's family trust, the very lifeblood that had kept his overvalued company afloat, had vanished overnight, legally withdrawn under a meticulously triggered ethics clause. Furthermore, his top 3 clients, all old money connections of Raven's father, had abruptly canceled their contracts, citing unforeseen strategic realignments. Grant returned not as a conquering CEO, but as a man walking into a slow-motion execution. He didn't bother going to the office. He came straight to Raven's penthouse, looking haggard, desperate, and remarkably less arrogant than he had 3 days prior in Aspen. When he walked into the expansive living room, Raven was seated elegantly by the floor-to-ceiling windows, nursing a cup of Earl Grey tea. She didn't offer him a seat. "Raven, you have to stop this," Grant pleaded, his voice cracking with genuine terror as he paced the Persian rug. "You redestroying my company, you redestroying my life over what?" "One mistake, a moment of weakness. I was drunk, she was crying, it meant nothing." Raven took a slow sip of her tea, the fine bone china clicking softly against the saucer. A moment of weakness that required a private jet and a $5,000 suite. "You must think very little of my intelligence, Grant, if you expect me to swallow that." "I was stupid," he cried, dropping to his knees near her chair, an act of submissive desperation that would have moved her to tears a month ago. Now, it only elicited a mild sense of revulsion. "I love you, Raven. You are the only woman I want to marry. Fiona is just. She is chaotic. She's troubled. I got caught up in trying to save her, and I lost my way, please. Let me fix this." The narcissist's playbook: blame the other woman, position himself as the flawed savior, and weaponize his supposed love. "Save her?" Raven echoed, a genuine laugh escaping her lips. It was a cold, sharp sound that made Grant flinch. "Grant, the only thing you were saving was your own ego. You thought you were engaging in some grand forbidden romance. You thought you were the center of her rebellious universe." She reached onto the glass coffee table and picked up a thick, manila envelope, the dossier Pierce had provided. She didn't hand it to him. She let it drop onto the floor in front of his knees. "Open it," she commanded softly. "Here is the autopsy of a male ego." Grant thought he was the main character in a tragic romance. He thought he was saving Fiona. The dossier revealed the brutal truth. He wasn't a savior. He was a discount vivid entertainment for a bored, wealthy woman. There is no pain quite like realizing you were the safe, dumb American boy. Raven didn't just ruin him financially, she destroyed his narrative. He realized he was the side piece, the free escort, the distraction. Raven showed him that while he was playing checkers with her heart, Fiona was playing 4D chess with his dignity. He lost his money. Yes, but realizing he was cheap, that is the wound that never heals. Grant stared at the envelope, his hands trembling as he reached for the flap. He pulled out the glossy photographs and the certified documents. His eyes scanned the pages, and Raven watched the exact moment his reality imploded. The documents detailed Fiona's marriage to Julian von Habsburg, a prominent European aristocrat. The marriage certificate, the heavily redacted prenuptial agreement guaranteeing her an astronomical monthly allowance, and the irrefutable evidence of Julian's long-term relationship with a male British polo player. What is this?" Grant whispered, the blood draining completely from his face, leaving him the color of ash. "She's married to a gay man." "A lavender marriage," Raven clarified, her tone clinical. "Highly lucrative. It allows him to maintain his conservative family's approval and his inheritance, while she lives a life of absolute luxury, free to do whatever and whoever she pleases, as long as it stays out of the European press." Grant's breathing became shallow and erratic. He stared at the photo of Fiona, radiant in a bespoke wedding gown, standing next to a man who clearly had no interest in her. "You weren't her grand romance, Grant," Raven said, delivering the final fatal blow to his self-worth. "You were just convenient, a safe, dumb American boy who fed her vanity. To her, you aren't a forbidden lover. a free escort, a gigolo she could summon whenever her husband was out of town. And the moment this scandal threatens her allowance, she will cut you off without a second thought. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, broken only by the sound of Grant's ragged breathing. He had lost everything: his fiancée, his company, his wealth, and now the very core of his identity. He had believed he was a master manipulator, juggling the devotion of two women. Instead, he was nothing more than a pawn, a cheap toy used by a woman far more cynical than he could ever hope to be. He didn't argue, he didn't beg anymore. The psychological destruction was so complete he couldn't even formulate a defense. He slowly gathered the papers, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and stumbled to his feet. He looked at Raven, not with anger, but with the hollow, terrifying emptiness of a man who realized he was truly, fundamentally alone. He walked out of the penthouse without a word. Raven watched the door click shut, feeling a profound, clean emptiness. The poison was gone. She picked up her phone and dialed the number she now knew by heart. "Pierce?" she said when he answered, his deep voice immediately grounding her. "It is done. He knows everything." "Good," Pierce replied, the quiet satisfaction evident in his tone. "I have reservations at La Bernardin tonight. Shall we celebrate?" Raven looked out at the sprawling, glittering skyline of the city, a city that finally felt like hers again. "I'd love that," she said, and for the first time in a very long time, she meant it. 6 months later, the city was draped in the glittering, frantic energy of a sudden autumn downpour. Raven stood beneath the sprawling awning of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the heavy beat of the rain drowning out the city traffic. She was wrapped in a tailored trench coat, the collar turned up against the chill, her arm looped securely through Pierce's. Tonight had been a triumph. The gala, an event largely underwritten by Pierce's firm, had cemented Raven's position not just as a wealthy heiress, but as a formidable philanthropic force in her own right. She had given the keynote speech, her Spanish flawless, her poise unshakable. Pierce had watched her from the front row, his gaze, always intense, always completely focused on her, filled with a quiet, terrifying pride. He wasn't a man who needed to diminish her light to make his shine brighter. He was the dark velvet against which her diamonds sparkled. Speaking of diamonds, Raven glanced down at her left hand where a custom-cut, impossibly flawless emerald-cut diamond rested on her ring finger. Pierce hadn't offered a grand public spectacle. He had proposed on a quiet Tuesday morning in his kitchen, sliding the ring onto her finger as she drank her coffee, stating simply that he had waited long enough and had no intention of waiting another day. It was arrogant, presumptuous, and utterly perfect. "The car is pulling around," Pierce said, his voice a low rumble over the sound of the rain. He adjusted the lapel of her coat, his knuckles grazing her cheek. "You were magnificent tonight." "I had excellent motivation," Raven replied, leaning briefly into his touch. As they waited for the valet, a sudden harsh laugh echoed from the shadows near the service entrance. Raven turned her head. A man was leaning heavily against the damp brick wall, his clothes rumpled and smelling faintly of stale beer and wet wool. He was arguing aggressively with a security guard who was attempting to herd him off the museum steps. He turned, the harsh street lamp catching his face. It was Grant. He looked 10 years older. The arrogant tech bro swagger was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, twitchy energy. His startup had officially filed for bankruptcy 3 months prior, after a very public, very humiliating series of investor lawsuits. Fiona, predictably, had vanished the moment the scandal threatened her European allowance, leaving him entirely alone to face the wreckage. He saw Raven. His bloodshot eyes widened, fixing on her pristine white coat, on Pierce's imposing, protective stance, and finally, on the massive diamond catching the light on her finger. For a second, Raven thought he might shout, or beg, or cause a scene. He took a stumbling step forward, his mouth opening, the ghost of his old entitlement flickering briefly across his haggard features. "Raven," he croaked, the word barely audible over the rain. Raven looked at him. She searched herself for anger, for pity, for the lingering sting of betrayal. She found nothing. He wasn't a monster anymore. He was just a cautionary tale, a minor inconvenience she had successfully navigated. "Do you know him?" Pierce asked, his voice deadly calm, shifting his body slightly to obscure Grant's view of her. It wasn't a question born of insecurity, but of a quiet, ruthless readiness to eliminate a threat. "No," Raven said, her voice clear and completely devoid of emotion. She met Grant's desperate gaze one last time, offering him a smile that was colder than the autumn rain. "I don't know him at all." The sleek black Maybach glided to a halt in front of them. Pierce opened the door, shielding her from the rain with an umbrella, and she slid into the warm, leather-scented interior. She didn't look back as the car pulled away, leaving Grant standing alone in the downpour, a ruined man watching his salvation drive away. Later that night, the news alerts would flash across her phone. A brief, tragic note about a former tech CEO involved in a fatal hit and run on a wet city street. Far across the Atlantic, rumors would begin to circulate about a prominent socialite's highly publicized, messy divorce and subsequent stay in an exclusive psychiatric facility. But Raven wouldn't read those articles. She would be sitting in front of a roaring fire, her feet tucked beneath Pierce, a glass of vintage Bordeaux in her hand. She had learned the hardest lesson a woman could learn, that sometimes the fairy tale isn't about finding the prince. It's about surviving the villain, realizing your own worth, and understanding that the truest power lies in walking away and never, ever looking back. Let us discuss the pick-me girl phenomenon. Fiona is the archetype we are all exhausted by. The "I only hang out with guys because girls are drama" woman. She wears leather boots to a black tie dinner, not because she is unique, but because she is desperate to be the center of male attention. She weaponized her tomboy persona to slide under Raven's radar, relying on the oldest trick in the book, plausible deniability. But look at the difference in men. Grant needed a woman like Fiona, chaotic, broken, and one of the guys to feel like a man. He needed to be a savior to feed his fragile narcissism. Then there is Pierce. Pierce didn't need to save Raven. He didn't ask her to shrink. He handed her a dossier, a jet, and a key card. He gave her the ammunition and stood back to watch her shoot. That is the difference between a boy who wants a mommy and a man who wants a partner. Grant was threatened by Raven's strength. Pierce was turned on by it. Raven's victory wasn't just in the revenge. It was in the realization that she had been trying to squeeze a diamond personality into a cubic zirconia relationship. She upgraded her ring, her bank account, and most importantly, her standards. So here's the question for the comments tonight. Have you ever been gaslighted by the "she is just a friend" excuse? And more importantly, if you had Raven's resources, would you have just left, or would you have delivered the condoms personally? Tell me your exit strategies. The comments are open and I am reading. Madam Readout.